And, kind of our first talking point is I live here in California. I am a product of LAUSD, which is why I can't spell so well, so good, so whatever adjective I'm supposed to use. LAUSD was probably a fine school district, comparatively speaking to all the other school districts. We like to make fun of it if we live here in California. But the way that California handles their money with schools, I think, is kind of unique and also kind of crazy. And this goes back to, I pulled this up on Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia is like a really, really good website for just showing what actually happened. It's going to the camera, it's going to the film. There's no editorial, there's no journalism here, there's no slant, there's no bias, there's no partisan partisan politics going on. Best I can tell, all they do is they take, different propositions, different measures, different bills that have passed or failed, and they put them on here and they give you the facts, right? So the entire time that from my earliest memory of political advertisements, which, back in the day before Hulu and Netflix, you were kind of forced to see them because around election season, if you're watching anything, doesn't matter if I was watching Thundercats or whether my parents were watching Quantum Leap or my grandmother was watching the news, everything was a political commercial on the big networks back in the 80s and 90s. So as long as I can remember these political commercials were just like excessive, right? And they're always tugging at the heartstrings, and the bill and what it actually does is always a little different than how they advertise it. But for as long as I can remember, growing up here in California and living here my entire adult life, every single election cycle, there is something on the ballot to give more money to schools, and it doesn't matter whether it's a new sales tax or a new tax on properties or a new income tax or a new bond measure or whatever. There's always something, because if we could just give a little bit more money to the schools, if we could just renovate the schools, if we could just get some new technology in the schools, if we could just get a little bit more from the taxpayer, it would solve all of the problems. And what I don't really want to talk about in this podcast, because I don't want to be depressed about the fact that I might have to send my kids to public school here in California, is I don't want to look at the outcomes right now of educational quality, because that does get very political. The sources that I would tend to go to, the standardized tests I would tend to look at, the kind of educational experience, the outcome, the graduation rates, all the things that I would tend to look at would be very negative. I think the trend line for quality of education in most of the public schools in Southern California, LA specifically, but California overall, I think has probably been trending in the wrong direction for a long time. Now, of course, the reason I don't want to go into that, because it does get very political. I'm sure there's just as many studies and surveys and anecdotal evidence and actual evidence that might show that our education system in California is getting better, right? There's more computers per student. There's more technology per student. Maybe the college acceptance rates are higher, although that's probably just a byproduct of colleges springing up everywhere and everybody going to college at some point in their life. But that's not really the part that I wanted to get into. I wanted to get into the spending, right? Because this is the stuff that really interests me. And in order to really look at the spending for California schools, you really have to go back to 1988, which I knew that this was kind of the case, but obviously I was 9 years old in 1988, so I didn't vote on the policy, nor did I understand it, nor did I discover it until it was later in my 20s when I took kind of an interest in finance and budgets. But if you go back to 1998, there's this proposition, California Proposition 98, which is interesting. I don't know how we label our propositions here. I know their numbers, but I don't know if they go in sequential order and then they start over at 200, because I can think of a few famous propositions that have passed. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's California Proposition 98, passed in 1988. And what the proposition says is that no matter what, period, no qualifiers, no matter what, 40% of the California state general fund spending has to go to what they call K through 14 education. So kindergarten through junior college. We go K through 12 here. Obviously, 12th grade, you graduate. 13 and 14 is considered junior college or junior college outreach or transitional college or whatever you want to call it. But in the state of California, it is now part of our state constitution, as amended by Proposition 98, that 40% of all income, of all spending from the California General Fund has to go to education. Doesn't matter what it goes to. I'm sure it's broken down in many ways amongst the different school boards, but it just says 40% has to go there. And then you layer on the fact that A lot of municipalities, counties, cities, they have their own school districts that they support. Overall, I've seen estimates as high as 70% of tax revenue in California going to education K through 14, or you start to add public colleges, whether that's the Cal State system or the UC system. I've heard that as much as 70% of taxes collected in California at the state level, the federal level, the state level, the city level, the county level, the property taxes, the sales taxes, somehow, some way funnel itself into education, which would be fine if we were educating more people and we were educating them in a better way, right? Or they were becoming more educated. But I don't think there's a lot of people that would argue that the student body at whole is becoming more intelligent in California than they were a decade ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And I don't think that many people would argue that students coming out of 12th grade are more equipped to deal with the real world, the modern world, the technological world that we're living in. I would argue, or I think most people would argue that we have fewer trade programs. We have fewer pathways for people that aren't going to go to traditional college and work in an office job or do some type of service related job or do some services related job. There's just, they've gotten rid of a lot of stuff, right? They've gotten rid of a lot of the physical education. They've gotten rid of the shop classes and the automotive class and the stuff that would teach you how to weld, right? That's all now post 12th grade. That's now all trade schools. That's now all pay to play type trade educations, right? So again, I guess we are kind of going down that path. I wanted to stay away from that, but I would think that most people would agree that maybe education in California has gotten worse, or has at least equipped students, has not equipped students as well to go on to the next stage of their life. But here's what's interesting, right? So we have this proposition that passed where 40% of all income has to go towards education. But here's the problem. We're in for some really challenging budget times here in California. General revenues are down a bit, not a ton. I mean, only $4 billion. In the grand scheme of things, $4 billion is something that the state should be able to overcome. This chart pulled up from the Legislative Analysis Office. So this is the nonpartisan, just fiscal and policy advisor for the state of California. This is kind of where you go to see where all of our tax dollars at a state level are spent, without it being political or any editorial in here. They're talking about the state having a $54 billion budget problem. Okay, so that's a problem. Maybe everybody's going to have to tighten their belts, including the schools, but 40% of the budget still has to go to schools. And remember, 40% of the budget doesn't mean 40% of the revenues, right? Because we can have revenues in California of $180 billion, but we can have a budget of $220 billion and just have that $40 billion shortfall that we're either going to finance, or we're going to borrow, or we're going to push into previous years, or we're going to pull out of the general ledger overflow. I think in California, our savings account is called the budget stabilization account. Yeah. So this year we're going to pull, I take it back. In last year, 2019 to 2020, we pulled about $2 billion. No, this is in millions. So that's 2,000 million. What's 2,000 million? That's 2 billion, right? 2,000 millions. Yes, it's 2 billion. So 2,000 millions are 2 billion. So last year, we basically, as a state, took $2 billion out of our BSA, our budget stabilization account. We put that back into the general fund to come up with shortfalls in the budget. And remember, last year, we didn't even experience the whole weight of COVID-19 because the stock market was up. Earnings amongst the wealthiest people in California who pay something like 80% of the taxes was up. Sales taxes were down, obviously. Revenue from local municipalities, which a lot of it comes from property taxes and sales tax and licensing fees for restaurants and stuff. That stuff was way down, but we actually didn't do too bad as a state last year in our budget because we're super top heavy. We get some god awful amount, like 80% of our tax revenue at the state level, which comes mostly from personal income tax. We get that from the wealthiest people in the state, right? So, although there's this narrative that the wealthy don't pay their fair share in the state of California, the top 10% of earners pay something like 80% of all income taxes that funds the general revenue budget. So anyway, I digress. We're here, the total amount of revenues here, and then let's look at the total budget. Oh, this is all just about the $54 million shortfall. I don't know if this has the total budget number. I was looking at that earlier. Subtotals. Oh yeah, total revenue is about 140 million. I think we announced oh, here we go. Features of the 2021 major spending. Education, of course, K through 14 education. You know, we're going to spend around $70 billion on education in the state of California, and universities, yada, 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 yada. And I think, let's just Google it real quick. I think total California, I think it's $220 billion ish. Total state California budget 2021. Let's see here. There we go. Governor Newsom proposes 21-22 budget, and the total budget, yeah, hey, I was right, $227 billion is what we're going to spend, even though we're only projecting that we're going to bring in significantly less than that. And that goes back to this article of like, we have this $54 billion budget problem based on revenues being marginally lower and incomes not being as high as, or spending being higher and incomes being slightly lower. Okay, so how does this matter to schools, right? So 40% of the general budget has to go to, the general fund has to go towards education. But I think we're in for a big fight in California over education, maybe like a generational fight, because just recently, for the first time that I can remember, Measure EE did not pass. So if you go back to the election about 2 years ago, the midterm election, we had this Measure EE where, and it's kind of interesting in California. In most other states, you have to have a simple majority, so 50.001% to pass certain tax laws. In Los Angeles County, and I think in the entire state, you have to have a 2/3 majority, right? So there was this proposal that Mayor Garcetti backed really hard. He pushed this really hard, and Measure EE was going to take 16 cents. Yeah, 16 cents per square foot of indoor space for any house in Los Angeles County. And it was going to be this new tax, right, on homeowners, because homeowners are the people that effectively pay for the schools in each county. So Measure EE would have raised the taxes on a, let's see, 16 cents per square foot. It probably has it in here. It's probably $300 for a kind of average size house. 16. Yeah, I think I actually read it in here. I think it said it was ended up being about $250 per like 1,500 square foot house. That makes sense. What's 1,500 times 16 cents, Chris? We'll get this number in a minute because I think that's about right. Yeah, 1,500 square feet, kind of like your average bungalow house in California.
240.
Okay, so this was going to be a new tax for kind of your average middle-class homeowner in Los Angeles County. It was going to be about $250, $240. If you own a larger house, like a nice 3,000 square foot house out in the suburbs of Los Angeles County, this was going to cost you about $500 a year. And the people of Los Angeles and on a grander scheme, California, and some other things they voted for, they basically said no. For the first time that I can remember as an adult, they said, no, we're not doing this. Like there's plenty of money in the budget. You know, for example, the last two major school projects that we built in Los Angeles County, and maybe Chris can fact check this as well. I think like the Kennedy School and the art school that got built downtown LA, I think it was something like $600 million to build a school. And I mean, these things look like art installations. Maybe you can put the picture up, Chris, when you post this, of like the school downtown, the art school that has like this weird like circular wrap around this big pyramid looking thing. It doesn't look like a school. It looks like something out of a Disney ride or something.
Yeah, Kennedy Learning Center in Los Angeles, California, the nation's most expensive public school ever built, is on 23 acres of land costing $578 million.
$578 million to build a school, which is really just a museum to the Kennedy family. Like talk about like pet projects. And so the county and the voters, you know, Mayor Garcetti and kind of the political left thought this was going to pass with no problem with 2/3 vote. And it only passed with 45% of the vote, which is unheard of. It wouldn't even have passed a simple majority. And I can tell you over and over and over again, every 2 years, every election cycle for my entire adult life, there's been some measure on the ballot. Just give us a little bit more money in the school system. If we just had a little bit more money at the county level, if we just had a little bit more money at the state level. But I think Californians are finally waking up to the fact that like, no, our schools aren't underfunded. We just have too much bureaucracy. We have too many bureaucrats. We have too much wasted money. We have too many pet projects like $570 million construction programs for schools. Like, you can probably build a school like the one that I went to, which was basically just looked like a brick shack. You can probably build that in California for 100 or 200 million. You don't need to spend $600 million on primo real estate downtown. And what's interesting is you could probably make the argument that we need these new expansive $600 million schools if school enrollment was going up. However, God forbid anybody actually look at the underlying data and the facts. If you go to the LAUSD school district, directly to the school district, the report from the 2020 superintendent's final budget, you can see, and they break this down in so many different ways, it gets confusing. There's like 8 different charts to try to explain how many kids are receiving education from LAUSD. But this one chart that we start with, and let's just go off of this. This might not be perfect, but for our purposes, it at least shows a trend. If you go back 10 years to school year 2012 to 2013, total graded students, so total children educated in LAUSD was 655 million. That's all grades, K through 12, and then kind of special enrollment classes, special ed, continuing ed. Those were all my friends in high school that had to go to the different school because they got themselves in a little bit of trouble. You can see the numbers have dropped drastically in the last 10 years, from 655,000 students down here in 2012, 2013, to the estimated amount that will be in school 2021 to 2022, it'll be 563,000. So we've had a dramatic drop in school attendance. Now that's probably because birth rates are low. For any of you that keep in touch with or keep on top of any political news, you've seen with this most recent census report, for the first time ever in recorded history of the state of California, our overall population went down. The state of California, maybe Chris can look this up, I think we just lost 2 congressional seats in the most recent census data. We either lost 2 or 3 congressional seats, because remember, of all the congressional seats, they're split up by state, by population. And for the first time ever in recorded history of California, so we're going back a couple 200 years, to 1812, I think. We're going back over 200 years. California has seen a net exodus of people.
We just lost 1.
We just lost 1? Oh, I thought we lost 2 or 3. Okay, well, lucky us. We only lost 1. What was the census data? Like, I think we're net negative, like 500,000 people or 1 million people. And by the way, this is after every previous census report showed, 5 to 10% increases in state population. So I'm glad we only lost 1. Maybe it's not as bad as we thought.
Okay, and I'm just reading an article here, but
Yeah.
It looks like our population actually grew by 2.3 million people, but that's far slower than the growth of the rest of the United States.
Got it. So we had a net outflow based on total population, but still 2 million more people.
That's what the AP article I'm looking at says.
Okay, Associated Press is pretty good. All right, so I stand corrected. We had a net inflow of individual bodies, but not keeping up with overall population growth. And I would guess that that's showing up here also in the data of the number of kids that are in each school. Chris and I were talking the other day, the school that we went to, Glendale High School, and then I moved out to the desert and went to Palmdale High School. Both of those schools kind of anecdotally are down dramatically in their overall enrollment and graduating classes. So I don't know what those trends are all about. I don't know if it's an outflow of people. I don't know if it's, fewer births in California, fewer youth in California. Hopefully it's not just people not going to school, but the numbers are going down, right? And I think at some point, somebody's going to understand this, and either a special interest group who's sick of the amount of money that's being spent on schools, or some savvy politician that wants to make this an issue to run on, they're going to start explaining to the people of like, hey, we've been putting trillions of dollars into our California education system for the last 50 years. The outcomes are arguably getting worse, or at least not getting better. And we have this antiquated law from 1988 that said 40% of the budget has to go to all of the school and education in California. 40% of that budget has to go, but we're actually down something like 15% of students being educated. So why do we need the same percentage of the budget going towards those educational goals if we're actually educating less people? Now, it does get very complicated at the county level, which is what we're looking at here, LAUSD, versus the state level, because the state level is also spending a lot of that, but those budgetary line items on the collegiate system, which has grown dramatically in California. We have a lot more colleges in California than we did 50 years ago. We have a lot more college attendees than we did 50 years ago. We have a lot more junior college attendees, I believe, than we did 30 years ago, almost, when this law was passed in 1988. Is that 30 years ago? It's more than 30 years ago. We're so old, Chris. That was 34 years ago, 1988. Wow. But I think we're just in for this big fight in California, and it's something that I want to learn more about. Some of you that might be watching this have heard me say before that I hired a tutor. He's a PhD student, and he's kind of teaching me how to go look all this stuff up for myself, because, you know, it's not that hard to look at the underlying data. You don't have to count on, you know, your favorite editorial in the Wall Street Journal to give you an analysis of an article that was written by somebody in MSNBC who was, you know, paraphrasing an article that they saw on CNN for a guy that maybe had his assistant look at the underlying data, right? So by the time we, and I include myself in this, get our opinions from a 5 or 10 minute YouTube clip, or by the time that we, you know, read a story which is an editorialized version of another story, which is like another story that wasn't fact checked, you know, this stuff can get really convoluted. And so what I've hired this tutor to do is like, help me dive in and actually look at the data so I can parse this stuff out myself. And man, I think LAUSD, the California education system, you know, our budget, I think there's going to be a big fight over this in the near future. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a proposition in the next couple years saying like, hey, you know, we're not keeping up with population growth. We're educating fewer people, and we're spending way more money because the overall budget and the overall spending in California has drastically increased since 1988. Some of that because of inflation, some of that just natural, you know, growth of the state and growth of budgets as needed. But some of it has just been basically irresponsible spending. And I think we're in for a fight over this Proposition 98, where we don't need 40% of all revenue to go to education, unless we're going to find a way to hold people accountable for better incomes, or better outcomes, not better incomes. Well, better outcomes then turn into better incomes in adult life. So those are my thoughts on that.